We're marking two incredibly painful anniversaries today. On July 18, 1994, a car bomb exploded in front of the AMIA Jewish Communal Center in Buenos Aires, Argentina, killing 85 people and injuring hundreds. It was the deadliest terrorist attack in Latin American history. The evidence that this was an Iranian-sponsored attack carried out by Hezbollah agents operating in the region is overwhelming. And still, 27 years after the bombing, no one has been brought to justice except for secondary actors. On the same day, July 18th, this time in 2012, a suicide bomber blew up a passenger bus transporting Israeli tourists that had arrived from Tel Aviv at the Burgas airport in Bulgaria. The explosion killed the Bulgarian bus driver and 5 Israelis and injured 32 other Israelis. In 2013, Bulgaria recognized that there was well-grounded evidence that Hezbollah was behind the attack, leading to a ban by the European Union of Hezbollah's so-called military wing in the same year. To this day, less than a handful of EU member states have designated the full organization as a terrorist entity, and Hezbollah continues to operate its criminal enterprises via key hubs in Europe. Here with us today are Matthew Levitt and Gustavo Perednik, two distinguished experts who will help us better understand the context in which these brutal terrorist attacks happen and put them in the broader picture of Hezbollah's continued operations to this day. Matthew Levitt is the Fromer-Wexler Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and director of its Jeanette and Eli Reinhard program on counterterrorism and intelligence. From 2005 to early 2007, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Analysis at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. And during his tenure, he played a central role in efforts to protect the U.S. financial system from abuse and, especially relevant to today's conversation, to deny terrorists, weapons proliferators, and other rogue actors the ability to finance threats to U.S. national security. From 2008 to 2009, Levitt served as a State Department counterterrorism advisor to the Special Envoy for Middle East Regional Security, and previously provided tactical and strategic analytical support for counterterrorism operations at the FBI, focusing on fundraising and logistical support networks for Middle Eastern terrorist groups. Gustavo Perednik is a philosopher, writer, and educator. He's been a guest lecturer in more than 50 countries, including China, where he directed the Al-Tian program. Perednik has published 20 books, 2 of which deal with the work of his friend, the late AMIA case prosecutor Alberto Nisman, namely To Kill Without a Trace and To Die for Argentina. He previously directed the 4-year program at Hebrew University, where he was distinguished as outstanding lecturer. His book, Judeophobia, examines the roots of hatred toward Jews and various theories explaining the phenomenon, which was the topic of his doctoral thesis. Perednik currently lectures on philosophy and on the history of Zionism in the Rimonim program at Herzog College and lives with his family in Jerusalem. Matthew, Gustavo, thanks so much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
Well, let's begin first with you, Professor Perednik. Why did the attack happen in Buenos Aires? Why was it in Argentina that the target was selected? And what can you tell us about the initial investigation in the aftermath of the attack and why so many years were wasted as a result?
Thank you, Dan. I'm very glad to be once again at B'nai Brief. And I would say there were 2 main reasons to choose Argentina as a target. And the issue was discussed by the Iranians on August 14, 1993, in the town of Mashhad, where the attack was decided and where it was entrusted to Hezbollah. The first reason to choose Buenos Aires was to punish the Argentine government for having canceled the nuclear agreements it had signed with Iran. The cancellation had been requested by the American government from President Carlos Menem when he decided to align Argentina with the American foreign policy. The second reason was that Argentina was an easy target. They learned from their experience when they blew up the Israeli embassy 2 years earlier in 1992. And there was no response whatsoever. Alberto Nisman explains in his prosecution opinion that in their meeting in Mashhad, Mohsen Rabbani suggested Argentina and that his proposal was accepted without reservation. After all, Rabbani lived in Argentina. Thus, he was suitable to weigh up the chances of success. You know that he had been residing in Argentina for almost a decade. He controlled the Shiite mosque at Tawid on San Nicolas Street in the Floresta neighborhood in Buenos Aires, and he had ousted the mosque imam Mualimi because Mualimi focused on religious topics and didn't want to follow the political agenda. Rabbani's motto was crystal clear: we are all Hezbollah. He was in charge of the logistics of the attack in Argentina, and his direct boss was the embassy third secretary, Ahmad Reza Asghari, a member of the Pasdaran, the guardians of the Islamic Revolution. Let me add that the Mashhad plotters had nothing to worry from the election of Argentina as a target, because experience shows that democracies fear when they have to defend themselves. Not only Argentina, I'm talking about the international level. Hitler knew this fact too well, and in the so-called Hosbach Protocol of 1937, he correctly predicted that no one would defend Czechoslovakia when Germany attacked it. When you manage to instill fear in your opponent, aggression pays. That explains the second part of your question, Dan. Why so many years were wasted? Menem, the president, didn't want to confront Iran too much. Two ministers in his cabinet guided him as how to start the general cover-up, how to fabricate culprits, as Nisman thoroughly revealed. The cover-up in the case of the embassy had been much worse. It had been not only a cover-up, but to some extent an expression of empathy towards the terrorists. Then, in 1992, the Supreme Court official Alfredo Bisordi suggested that the secret store of weapons might have imploded inside the building of the embassy. That meant Israel was to be blamed. Also, the chief of police, Jorge Luis Pacero, claimed that the embassy building had collapsed on itself, from which he concluded that there had been a secret ammunition store in the basement. Adolfo Vázquez, a Supreme Court judge and a personal friend of President Menem, took a step further and said that the attack had been carried out by Israelis who disagreed with their government. The Military Intelligence Coordination Center, which was still infested with fascists, embraced the implosion nonsense and claimed that the attack was the work of an Israeli terrorist group. Well, all this Judeophobic gibberish enabled the waste of precious time to investigate. You couldn't expect these kind of people to take seriously such an attack. They almost sympathized with the aggressor.
Well, Gustavo, I'd like to come back in a little bit to talk about Alberto Nisman, because clearly this is the part two of this case. But I'd like to go now to Matthew Levitt and to ask, what did we know? What was known at that time, talking about 1994, or perhaps in the early 90s, if we go back to the Israeli embassy bombing, what did we know about Hezbollah's activity, Iran's activity in Latin America at that time?
Jan, first of all, it's a pleasure to participate in this event with you and with Gustavo. Thanks for having me. We can look back now with 2020 hindsight vision. We can look at some of the declassified US government reports from the FBI and the CIA in particular, and we can gain some pretty clear insight into what the government did and did not know at the time. It's important to remember that back then, late 1980s, early 1990s, there was still a lot that was not known about Hezbollah, but there was a lot that was known. And one thing that was clear is that after the bombing of the Israeli embassy in 1992, there was, as you can imagine, a tremendous amount of effort put into understanding what happened and the roles that Hezbollah and Iran each played. And what became clear is between that and between Hezbollah activities back in Lebanon, where Hezbollah, after a series of bombings in Beirut in the 1980s, continued to kidnap Westerners, in particular Americans and French officials, there was a sense that Hezbollah and Iran intended to carry out more attacks. It wasn't entirely clear where. It wasn't entirely clear if it was going to be only targeting Israeli or potentially American or other interests. But one thing that was clearly a surprise was the return to Argentina, which in retrospect, as Gustavo mentioned, makes all the sense in the world. And also the decision to target an expressly Jewish target, not an Israeli government or an American government target, but a soft civilian textbook terrorism target in the AMIA Jewish Community Center. But we clearly knew at the time that Hezbollah and Iran were planning some things. We didn't know what. And I think it's important to give a little context and understanding that just a few weeks before the bombing of the AMIA Community Center in Buenos Aires, Hezbollah came this close to successfully bombing the Israeli embassy in Bangkok, Thailand, in a much less known plot, perhaps because it failed, where they put together a very large car bomb, very similar to the modus operandi in Buenos Aires. They positioned that car bomb within a approximately 2 to 3 mile radius in a car park of the intended target, exactly as they did in Buenos Aires. And the only reason they didn't succeed is because the driver got into a fender bender in morning rush hour traffic on his way to target the Israeli embassy. And as that plot is slowly unfolding, and a very unlikely group of international security agencies in places like Singapore and Thailand and the Philippines are beginning to partner with Israel and the United States in particular to figure that out, authorities are still not clear. Was that the plot that we knew was coming? Is something else coming? Furthermore, they weren't quite clear until quite some time later, though now the FBI has been very clear, that a much less known plot the day after the AMIA bombing, the bombing with a suicide bomber of a commuter airliner from Panama, with just a few passengers, but the majority of whom were members of the Jewish community. This too, we now know, was an act of aviation terrorism carried out by Hezbollah. We now not only know the name that the suicide bomber used to get on the plane, we know his true name, we know a lot about this case. FBI has made this all public, but we know that with 2020 hindsight. At the time, it was a fast-moving and developing target set for which we were not entirely clear exactly what was happening, but we knew threats were coming.
Gustavo, let's go back now to what I would call the second part. There are many parts to this case and this story, but for the purposes of this discussion, in 2005, Alberto Nisman was designated as the main prosecutor of the case, and a special investigative unit was created. What can you tell us about his work?
Well, about Nisman's work, I wrote in depth in my book To Kill Without a Trace, published after I brought Alberto to Israel for the first time. He started his work with about 40 top professionals. Under his leadership, the unit's task was to resuscitate the case after a decade of cover-up. He had to scrutinize 100,000 legal pages in more than 500 dossiers, plus 400 ancillary files and 1,700 intelligence documents. And despite this colossal effort, he soon reaped his first victory when the Argentine government admitted it had covered up the terror attack. But the first major success took place the following year on October 25th, 2006, when Nisman presented his first prosecutor opinion, 800 pages that proved that the state of Iran was guilty. Interpol ordered immediately the arrest of 8 Iranians, including top leaders of the regime. Now, I say first major success because Nisman's work on the AMIA case had two more turning points. In 2013 and in 2015. The first stage I've just mentioned had showed that the involvement of the Iranian state in the AMIA bombing. The second stage, 2013, proved that the attack was not an isolated incident. That was very well mentioned by Matthew just now. It was rather part of an international terror network. I must admit that my first impression when I saw that today we were going to refer both to the Burgas terror attack and the AMIA bombing, I kind of felt that by combining them, we were somewhat belittling the AMIA bombing. But Nisman would have completely approved of this pattern. Because when we link together several terror attacks, we precisely expose the international aspect of the Iranian death network. That was Nisman's main aim. His third victory took place 3 days before his murder, namely his denunciation of January 15, 2015, when he accused the then President Christina Kirchner and her co-conspirators of fabricating the innocence of Iran in exchange for money, thus concealing forever the largest terrorist attack in the history of Latin America. I would like to emphasize that this time it was not a mere cover-up, as it had been in the case of Menem. Regarding Christina's actions, we are dealing with full complicity with the Ayatollahs. Menem had never negotiated with Iran. When Alberto sent me a copy of the report he was going to present at the Argentine Congress on January 19, one day before his assassination, one day after his assassination, I wrote an article that you can find both in Spanish and English under the title, The Nisman Trilogy. Surrounded by cynics, Nisman helped that truth prevail over the many attempts to discredit him. Let us have in mind that his enemy's motivation was twofold. On the one hand, an alleged ideology of confronting imperialism, the worldview of Chavez. On the other, there are pure commercial interests. Argentina needed to receive cheap Iranian oil. I thus call it Nisman trilogy, his revelation of Iran's guilt in the AMIA attack, the fact that there is an Iranian world terror system, and Christina's complicity. Nisman's trilogy rests upon impeccable mountains of data, evidence, and professional investigation. Therefore, his enemies can criticize him, they can call him names, they can question his motivations and personality, but they will never be able to rationally refute hundreds of pages of his life.
Before we move on to Burgas, and I'll address the next question to Matthew, let me ask the obvious question here, 27 years on. Will there ultimately be justice served in this case? I mean, we've gone through many wasted years. Now, I think we're in a second phase of at least procrastination. Will we see justice, and where will we see those who perpetrated this crime brought to justice?
There are many ways to see justice. Some are more fulfilling than others, and I think that it's much more likely that what we will see is, as a result of Alberto Nisman's work, as Gustavo said, the facts put together in meticulous detail, but the likelihood that the perpetrators will ever be brought to justice is very, very low. Several of them have been or are today senior officials in the government of Iran. So long as the Islamic Republic of Iran maintains its existence in its current ideological form, I don't see them being brought to justice. I'd like to note that Alberto was also someone I knew well, and in support of his second 2013 report, in one of our many conversations, it came up. I had served as an expert witness here in the United States, in New York City, in a case that was a bomb plot targeting JFK International Airport, which had specific connections to Iran in Central and South America. And at his request, I put him in touch with the prosecutors in Southern District and Eastern District of New York. This was not just an investigation that Alberto Nisman did on his own through Argentinian sources. What Alberto did that perhaps was most impressive was liaison with everybody, with Northern European countries that you normally associate with Hezbollah, where he found an individual whose name was in a notebook that appeared in the hand of a Hezbollah operative from Brazil, who later turned up in Norway. And what he put together, what he mapped out, was really tremendously impressive. And as I was writing my book on Hezbollah, which came out in 2013, and as he was writing in particular his second report, we met quite a few times. And I think that's what sets it apart. We need to review and revisit that material, because other types of material are just not accessible anymore. Argentina did not maintain the banking records. Argentina did not maintain the immigration cross-border records. So what Nisman went back and reconstructed is the basis for the reality. As Senator Moynihan said, you have a right to your own opinion, not your own facts. The facts are out there. They are not disputable. And we need to hold Iran accountable to answer to those facts. But the reality is that the likelihood of rendering someone or getting someone in court in Argentina or the United States is very low, unfortunately.
Well, in that regard, Gustavo, and this will be before we move to Burgas, this case cannot be tried in absentia in Argentina, correct? There is no provision for an in absentia trial?
So there is really no hope under these circumstances. Trials in absentia are banned in some countries because they are considered a violation to the defendant's right to be present. However, trials in absentia must be held if the accused party refuses to cooperate and there is no way to bring him to a fair trial. But it won't be done under this government, because nothing will be done to reveal the truth of what happened, and all the evidence against the culprits will be either hidden or dismissed. Worse than that, the criminals will work very hard to continue discrediting Nisman. You must remember that the whole coalition with Iran was the baby of Chavez and Cristina. It started long before the memorandum of 2013. President Nestor Kirchner, Christina's late husband, always considered the AMIA mishandled case a national disgrace, in his words. A few months after he passed away in 2010, Cristina and her accomplices approached Iran. They had no qualms about contacting even the mastermind of the AMIA bombing, Mohsen Rabbani, to whom Hector Timerman promised he would persuade Interpol to drop the arrest warrants it had issued against the Iranians. They didn't expect that Interpol was going to reject their request. The goal of the conspiracy was to divert the investigation. In other words, to abandon Argentina's claim for justice and to doom the Damia case to oblivion. Their excuse was that the investigation had been allegedly paralyzed, which Nisman refuted completely. But once impunity was agreed upon, the two governments signed the 2013 infamous memorandum. However, the Ayatollahs grew angry when the Argentinian government failed to put a stop to Interpol's arrest warrants, and the memorandum therefore failed. But to sum up, it is impossible to make justice progress under the present circumstances. The last part of the Nisman trilogy we mentioned before unraveled the most disgraceful ruse in Argentina's entire history.
Let's move to Burgas. Matthew, what was the context of the attack in Burgas? And here I would ask the same question that we asked about Argentina. Why Bulgaria? And had there been existing signs that such an attack was possible and brought about? Was anybody seeing this kind of activity there?
So the Burgas plot did not occur in a vacuum. In the years after Israel and the United States partnered in a then covert operation to eliminate Imad Mughniyeh, the arch terrorist and leader of Hezbollah's terrorist wing, who until 9/11 had more American blood in his hands than anyone else. After that assassination in February 2008, Hezbollah took it upon itself to start targeting Israeli interests around the world. The first plot we saw was in Baku, Azerbaijan, where Hezbollah operatives were arrested as they were conducting surveillance of the Israeli ambassador and embassy. They were ultimately convicted, but then immediately released under Iranian pressure. And then we saw a series of plots in Turkey, kidnapping plots in Africa, all tied to this attempt to sort of avenge Imad Mughniyeh. Alongside this, you had the beginnings of a shadow war between Iran and the West over Iran's nuclear program prior to the Iran deal, the JCPOA. And Iran, around 2010, called in Hezbollah and its own Quds Force and said, look, we're going to have two parallel plots right now. We want the Quds Force to primarily target diplomats from countries trying to undermine our nuclear program. We want Hezbollah to primarily target soft targets, especially Israeli soft targets. And so now Hezbollah has two parallel operational lines going, one to avenge Imad Mughniyeh and one to play its role in Iran's shadow war with the West. Not long before the Burgas attack, just weeks before, an individual named Hussam Yaqub, a dual Lebanese-Swedish operative, and this idea of dual national operatives has become a very prominent modus operandi with Hezbollah, is arrested in Cyprus, conducting surveillance of Israeli tourists getting off their airplane and onto buses heading for resorts. He ultimately is convicted for criminal charges, not terrorist charges, because at that time, Cyprus, part of the EU, does not see Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. Just weeks later, we have the Burgas, Bulgaria attack, where almost identically, there is surveillance. We now know, again, looking back 2020 in hindsight, surveillance at the airport. Teams of Lebanese dual nationals who are Hezbollah operatives, a Canadian, a French official, a French citizen, an Australian citizen, and the bus of Israeli tourists is blown up, killing 5 Israelis, wounding several more, and killing the actually Muslim Bulgarian bus driver.
So describe to us in more detail the political aftermath of the attack. The Bulgarian government was swift to recognize the role of Hezbollah. How was this received in Europe? What was the process of getting to a unanimous, certainly more than imperfect, unjust, I would say, a decision of designating at least the so-called military wing? I say unjust, the decision to divide between military and political wings, when in fact Hezbollah never made such a distinction. And the truth of the matter is that when one talks about budgets, all money is fungible. So how did all of that happen? And it happened fairly quickly.
You need to understand that this was the first Hezbollah operation in Bulgaria, but it was not the first time Hezbollah did anything in Bulgaria. Hezbollah has done a lot of smuggling, for example, through Bulgaria. There had been a Bulgarian parliamentary report which documented this, for example. But for many in Europe, if a group like Hezbollah does small criminal things, they can be treated like small organized criminal elements, and it's something other than terrorism. Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, they kill everybody, that's terrorism. Something like Hezbollah, they often saw as something else, until they carry out an attack on your territory. The Bulgarians really saw that as something else. SANS, the Bulgarian Domestic Security Service, pounced on this. I had the opportunity to meet with some of the investigators personally on a trip to Bulgaria, and their investigation was really quite thorough. And they understood quite quickly what happened, who carried out the attack. Remember that one of the attackers wasn't actually intended in the first place, the long story, but one of them was killed. It was a de facto suicide attack. It wasn't intended to be. And so they had some evidence. They were able to track where the people came into the country. what border crossings they came through. They were able to work with Romania and Poland, other countries, to track how and when they came through. They had pictures, they had their false IDs, and they went to the EU as members of the EU to have this conversation. Remember, there had just been this plot in Cyprus. As all of this is happening, there are huge debates. And at the end of the day, I had the opportunity to testify for the European Parliament on this issue, pressing, as you, Dan, are now, and as I agree with you still, that Hezbollah should be designated writ large. But there were big debates as to whether or not that should be the way to go. And at the end of the day, what actually drove this home was not the Burgas, Bulgaria attack, and it was not the Cyprus attack. The biggest impediment at the end of the day was France. And France ultimately said, okay, because of Hezbollah activities in Syria. Remember, France has this historic colonial past with Greater Syria, Syria and Lebanon, many dual nationals, lots of business interests. And here they saw Hezbollah partnering with the Assad regime to butcher Syrian civilians and undermine the stability in the region. That ultimately is what pushed them past the line. But they did not want to do the whole organization, keep it to the military and terrorist wing. At the time, the United Kingdom was still part of the EU and had itself banned both the terrorist and military wings, and they really wanted the EU to follow suit. So the UK said, we'll help push this through, but only if it only goes as far as we've gone. Ironically, since then, the UK has left the EU, and they have expanded their designation to include all of Hezbollah, like the Netherlands long has, and like Germany recently did. And so now you have a situation where the UK out of the EU has banned all of Hezbollah. Germany and the Netherlands have inside, and Lithuania and Kosovo some small partners inside. But the EU itself is still stuck right now with its partial designation, which is better than nothing, but is nowhere near what it should be. And the likelihood of moving that in the near term at the EU level is complicated because of the need for unanimity within the Union.
Yeah, it's moving, but glacially to that point where we'd like to see this rectified because it's so clear and so obvious to us. Well, the two attacks happened 18 years apart on different continents, yet they share many key elements. What were the common threads, do you think? Matthew, we'll go to you first, and then Gustavo.
So I think it's important to recognize that for a group like Hezbollah, there really is no distinction between Jews and Israelis. And as I started doing research for my book on Hezbollah, and I was digging and collecting since declassified US intelligence reports, I came across other examples. At one point, for example, Hezbollah, and ironically, because they don't usually operate together, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, at one point were plotting a possible attack against Jewish emigres from the former Soviet Union who were congregating at a synagogue in Europe. That plot never happened. We don't know why. We just know that the CIA was reporting that they were plotting it at the time. You can see whether it happened or not that that kind of a target was not a problem for them. Here too, targeting Israeli civilians, targeting tourists, textbook terrorism, that for Hezbollah is perfectly fine. Hezbollah, you have to understand, sees terrorism as Iran does, as another tool of foreign policy, no more or less legitimate. And therefore, it doesn't make a difference if you're targeting military or government or civilians, it's all the same. Targeting places that have relatively lax security law enforcement, and targeting places that have political cleavages that can lead to the type of botched investigations that Gustavo talked about eloquently in Argentina. That did not work out for them quite as they planned in Bulgaria, where the Minister of Interior at the time in particular really drove this through, but I think they thought that it would. And we see that, of course, in Cyprus as well.
Gustavo, what do you see points of convergence here?
Well, let us remember that the Hezbollah is a gang established by Iran in 1982 among Lebanese Shiites as a military wing of the Islamic Revolution that had taken place 3 years before and has at aim a world conquest. Hezbollah is the Ayatollah's foreign army. It attacked Argentina twice. In 1998, the Argentine Supreme Court gave its final verdict. Hezbollah did carry out the attack against the Israeli embassy. Everybody knew it, but it was important that the court confirmed it, albeit 6 years later. But afterwards, thanks to Alberto, it was fully proven that Hezbollah also perpetrated the AMIA attack. Now, Hezbollah's headquarters are in Lebanon. So any change in the structure of Lebanon will affect immediately Hezbollah. And this country is suffering its worst economic crisis in the last 2 centuries, according to the definition of the World Bank. Its economic contraction has no precedent. Its people are almost entirely under poverty. Emigration of professionals is rampant. Out of its around 6 million people, 1 million are Syrian refugees. What is going to be the outcome of this catastrophe? The coming few months are crucial in this. Hezbollah could force the Lebanese mayhem to subjugate the country completely to Iran. It has actually been doing it during this long disintegration of the Lebanese state. Hezbollah is destroying the country's sovereignty, and many Lebanese blame Hezbollah for the situation. So the big question is, how will the outburst happen? There could be a civil war, like the war of 1975, but the Christians, led now by Samir Jaja, are not strong enough to fight Hezbollah by themselves. If Hezbollah surfaces victorious, the consequences could be terrorism everywhere. But I don't think this scenario is a possibility. I don't know what Matthew thinks of this. My reason is one, that the regime in Iran is being weakened by continual military and cybernetic operations against it. If the damage to its infrastructure continues, it won't be able for the Iranians to intervene in Lebanon. Hezbollah will be orphaned and it will slowly dwindle. Another scenario is that outsiders get involved. The possibilities are, Matthew mentioned France, also Saudi Arabia and Russia have interest to get involved, but nobody is willing to aid Lebanon as long as there is no functioning government there. Nasrallah is already trying to position himself and Iran as the country's savior. If we sum up the whole picture in 3 words, and I would say the world's main problem in 3 words, I would say Iran, Iran, and Iran. If the Ayatollahs are defeated, we live in a new world without Hezbollah, towards global peace. If not, the threat will always be.
Matthew, the final word on this. Alex, how are we doing? There we go. Matthew, a final word on this, just following up on what Gustavo said. With the explosion, the massive explosion in Beirut last year, perhaps there was a shift in Hezbollah's internal standing or not? Would you comment on that? And what do you see as the future?
Look, Hezbollah's standing in Lebanon is hurt because of the deep financial and political crisis in Lebanon. Hezbollah's standing is hurt like any of the mafia-style political elites' standing is hurt. But Hezbollah is by no means down and out. Hezbollah is only one of the corrupt elements in the Lebanese political system, but it is the de facto enforcer of this corrupt political system by virtue of being the only militant party to maintain its arms after the Taif Accords. So Hezbollah remains in a very capable position to smuggle weapons, money, contraband, to take advantage of politics, to take advantage and thereby undermine the Lebanese financial system, which is the backbone of the government. It remains capable of importing precision-guided missile components, which it continues to store in urban and residential areas. The Israelis just revealed another location with its precise coordinates earlier today. Hezbollah even still maintains a dedicated assassination unit, Unit 121, whose purpose is to assassinate fellow Lebanese who are too vocal in their opposition to the regime. That can include people as prominent as former Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri. A senior Hezbollah official was convicted of that crime by the UN Special Tribunal for Lebanon in The Hague. Or it can be a prominent intellectual like Luqman Slim, who was recently and tragically assassinated in Lebanon. So I think looking forward, neither Hezbollah nor Israel want an actual resumption of war at this time for various reasons. But Hezbollah doesn't collect these precision-guided missiles as playthings and paperweights. It uses them, it has them, and Iran wants them there so that if either Iran or Hezbollah decide now is the time, they will be able to use them. And at some point, there will be a renewed conflagration with Hezbollah across Israel's northern border.
Well, certainly the stockpiling of these rockets is, Gustavo and I are speaking today from Jerusalem, certainly on the minds of every Israeli. And we'll leave that for the next conversation about Iran, Hezbollah, Lebanon, and the Middle East. Matthew, Gustavo, thank you so much for this conversation. We've learned a great deal about the shared threads of global terror carried out by Hezbollah. We appreciate the fact that both of you were able to join me today for this conversation.
Thank you for having us, and keep up the great work.
Well, thank you to Matthew Levitt and Gustavo Perednik for bringing their expertise and perspectives to our conversation today. And thank you for tuning in to the second part of B'nai B'rith's two-part conversation, focusing on Hezbollah's malign influence and behavior across the globe, from AMIA to Burgas and more. If you found this discussion to be interesting, make sure you never miss a program by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel, liking us on Facebook, and following us on Twitter. And be sure to visit our website, bnaibrith.org, to learn more about our important work. Take care, everyone.